This week on Carlie's Couch, we're talking about shame and how it plays a role in our lives.
Hola, ¿cómo estás?
You talking to me?
I am talking to you.
Oh. Bien. ¿Y tú?
Así.
Oh, debemos hacer un episodio en español. No.
Sí.
No, probably not.
¿Podemos tratar?
Sí, pero ellos no pueden entenderlo todo.
Ay, es la
Así
más
que eso es-
importante.
Yeah, it's kind of pointless.
Yeah.
So now that we're done being selfish,
But shout out to y'all who understood us. I actually need to practice my Spanish anyways.
and yeah, it's when she's trying to say something, you be like, what was that?
But what's
if it's
funny,
slow, it's not crazy.
what's funny is anytime I'm in a Spanish speaking country, like I'm good. Like I'm much easier. Maybe I feel more confident because I have to use it there. But here I feel like I struggle more to actually use it. So
So the problem is you not practicing or not feeling like you have to.
well, no, I was saying more so just having people around that speak Spanish all the time. Like I don't spend time. Like I remember in Dallas, I used to go to meetups where we would do 30 minutes English. So for people who wanted to practice English, 30 minutes Spanish, 30 minutes English, 30 minutes Spanish. And, I would go to those like once a week for a while just to practice, like actually having conversations. Because I can read and write real easy, but it's the actual conversations that matter the most.
So you could do that here, right?
Yeah, I just got to actually do it.
Or you can go to certain places and you just decide to speak Spanish, they'll probably speak it back to you, I think. But it's definitely a little bit harder than or it's like instead of it just being you doing it, for somebody to speak to you makes it seem more like, okay, now's a good opportunity to practice or to try it. So that makes sense. Today we are talking about shame.
So after our Spanish introduction, hello to shame. What is shame?
Not hello to shame. Hello, shame. My good friend.
If I say it, might be the episode title.
Oh, shame. So we recently spoke about embarrassment, and we talked about how embarrassment can play a role in your life, or how it feels to be embarrassed, how you can use embarrassment to gain something, learn something in some way. There's always some positive spin to it, of course. But shame is kind of similar, but a little bit deeper, I would say, when you're talking about just like the levels of maybe the way it affects you, impacts your life, etc. I feel like embarrassment is used a little bit more lightly than the word shame. But for me personally, and you can speak to this for you, shame is not something like I ever really grew up thinking about or hearing about. And yet now to think back on my life, it's like, I see a lot of like, whether it's through church stuff or parenting or whatever, like I can identify shame in a different way. What about you? Like, is that something you thought about really?
I was about to say, yeah, outside of the scarlet letter, like shame, like shame on you and your house, or shame on you and your cow.
And then like Game of Thrones, that could be the episode image. Shame. Yep.
So thinking like outside of those, not really, but I do think it's much more prevalent than we actually give word to. I think it's just something we don't think about that deeply, or maybe just don't have the language to actually put it. We're like, oh, we're sad, or we feel guilty, or we, you know what I mean? Like think about the commonly used words that seem like something super extreme. So like, even though I can see a bunch of instances of it in my life, it's like wasn't a word I ever really thought about too much.
Yeah, the definition of shame is a feeling of embarrassment or humiliation that arises in relation to the perception of having done something dishonorable, immoral, or improper. And so, the first thing I thought about was like, well, what's the difference between shame and guilt? Because they are a little bit different, but I think we kind of use those terms the same. Carlie and I spoke about shame in episode 84. That you can go back and listen. I mean, guilt, you're right. We talked about guilt in episode 84. And so when we were thinking about this topic of shame, it's like, is that different? Like, what is going to be different about this conversation, which led us to discover what those differences are. And so what are kind of those differences?
So the first one is guilt is generally about something that you've done. like a mistake or something that you did wrong or a behavior or something that you feel bad about. So you feel guilty because you did X.
And then on the other hand, shame refers to something about your character or like who you are as a person, and you believing that that's unacceptable.
And so it's like guilt is I did this, and shame is kind of like I am this. Like in my head, like when I was trying to think of the difference, it was like, okay, well, what does that look like? Like guilt was, oh man, you know, I lost that match. Whereas shame might be like, I'm a loser. It's like kind of internalized, like taking it to that next level.
Yeah, and like guilty might just be feeling like, oh man, I accidentally broke something or I did something. But shame, you didn't actually do anything wrong. So like in the guilt, you might have did something, or somebody's making you feel like you did something. With shame, it's also maybe not always, but it seems like it's mostly kind of like a self kind of inflicted thing, or something where it's what you're telling yourself about yourself, or what you're believing to be true about yourself based on whatever standards, perceptions, and all of those things. So guilt is about actions, shame about being wrong as a person.
Yeah, and I think that's a huge and a very important distinction, because shame can be very corrosive to yourself, your self-confidence, and to like your life, your relationships. Whereas like guilt is actually can be a good thing, you know, to help you change behavior or to do better, or to inspire you to not keep being the same way. You know, whatever the thing is, I think that guilt kind of serves a purpose to help us like notice when we're misaligned with things, whereas shame like doesn't really have a purpose. It seems to be just kind of a way for us to tear ourselves down. It's kind of what it sounds like.
And so that made me kind of think of an example. What about like for somebody who might be in prison or something, like you may have been guilty of a crime, and yet it's still possible, and you probably do feel, well, not probably, you might feel a lot of shame, but that can be like mended. Like you can mend the shame part to say like, you know what, I made that mistake when I was a kid, or I robbed the store, or whatever you did. I hurt this person, and I feel a lot of shame around that. And maybe it could feel good to have the guilt around it, but like at a certain point, you don't have to keep identifying in that space with the shame. And so you can still, I think it's still beneficial to be able to separate the two, because now you can say, you know what, I do feel guilty about this thing. I did this thing, but I don't have to live in that space. And so to be able to separate that now kind of gives you a way to move forward through that, and to kind of make whatever those changes are.
Yeah, and shame might be necessary. You know what I'm saying? If you was out here wilding, or you hurt somebody, or whatever, you cheat in a relationship, whatever the thing is, like you actually might, you know, have a little bit of shame, which might be healthy to help you realize to get out that situation. But I think it becomes problematic. It's like whenever you're constantly living in that overly harsh environment that you kind of created within yourself.
And similarly, help me get back to the point that we're on, but like similarly, it's appropriate and okay to shame certain things. Like there's certain behaviors, pedophilia and other things, where it's like, yes, of course, we're going to shame that as a society. And then other things that should not be shamed, same-sex relationships. We may shame that, and it's like, that's not really something that we necessarily should. That gets into whole other conversations, but basically just saying that to say, also, you know, in talking about shame, it's not just something that we might feel, but also consider how you might be making somebody else feel, especially if you're a caretaker, or as any relationship, I guess a friend, a family member, whatever. You know, how you talk to people, and we've talked about this before, where it's like, not, oh, you're such a bad kid or whatever, but you know, like what you did was wrong. I think that's almost like the opposite side of what we're saying as far as guilt and shame, how you feel it, and then how you can keep from like placing those seeds of shame into somebody else.
Because we've all had them placed in us, and it doesn't feel good. And so I think the more we are aware of our language and with other people, like it's like, think about how that would feel to you as well. And like, do you want to be shamed for what you believe in, or how you feel, or what's really important to you? And it's like, no. So it's also a check, you know, if I also think that the phrase hurt people is very true. And also, so if you have a very negative self-image, you also might be saying things to people to diminish theirs or to hurt them.
Yeah. And shame is more of, or I view it as more of like a long-standing thing. So like, it is important to think about that, because as a child, or even when we think about our own things, that places where we might have shame in our lives, which we'll get to, a lot of that you're like, oh dang, like that came from you as a child, and you know, all the things we've talked about this stuff in episodes before, so you know what we mean. But it's like now that has affected the way you move through your whole life and your decisions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So shame can become foundational where it perhaps shouldn't. Not perhaps, it shouldn't. And so now it's like to identify that is the base for some of the things that you might be doing or saying to yourself can be very helpful to break free from some of those things and to like move into a different space.
And we'll get into some examples, but I really think it is a deep-rooted thing. And another reason why identifying shame in your life is super important is because shame is a linking emotion or factor, like contributor to many mental health diseases. If you look up like strong emotions that are associated with all of them, and it's shame. And that's because it starts to break away your foundation of yourself. And if you're living in this world where you feel like you're less than and you're beating yourself up every day, like it only makes sense that some type of sickness would follow that.
Yeah, imagine. I was asking when we were thinking about this episode, mental health issues come from a lot of different places, but then it was like, we don't have to overthink it. Like, imagine if you're just talking badly to yourself every day. Like, of course, like you're gonna be in that kind of space. So, definitely makes sense. There's different ways to think about shame, just so you can maybe think about how to identify it in your life. There's different types. So just to kind of throw out a couple at a time. Transient shame is like a fleeting feeling, like you made a mistake, I feel ashamed. Maybe like the wind blew your skirt up and it's like, ooh, feel ashamed. Then there's chronic shame where you feel it all the time, and that's more so, again, something like I never would have identified that. Like I never would have been like, if somebody's like, oh, do you feel shame? Like, no, I don't really feel ashamed or anything. But when you really think about what that really is, it's like thinking you're not good enough, and what we were just saying as far as that negative talk, self-speak, and things that can affect your mental health. That's chronic shame, because you are like constantly like, I'm not this, I'm not that. Like you are going through shame and moving through those motions.
And then we talked about embarrassment and how it can be a good thing, but humiliation is not, and can definitely cause shame if you're critically embarrassed in front of people, like job ending, like just life ruining type of humiliation. If you get
fired or something in front of everybody or something.
Like that could be
basically like a villain origin story type of thing.
1,000,000%. There we go. Villain origin story. Another one, and I've experienced this, is failure or defeat. Like think about like sports and competition. Like you didn't win the thing, or it just wasn't enough. Like it didn't work.
And maybe it's not that you didn't win. Maybe you like kicked the into the other goal or something like. Like, and everybody's gonna be like wilding you out. Like,
bro, I definitely have busted my ass on hurdles, and the 100-meter hurdles. If you ever into a track meet, are right in front of the stands, and I've ate it like multiple times. So yes, shame of defeat and or like embarrassing yourself out on the track.
You can experience shame around strangers, and that's connected to social anxiety. If you know or feel like you might kind of have some social anxiety, it's like kind of people seeing your imperfections, and you have shame about that. You have shame about not being perfect, essentially, which makes it hard for you to socialize. And shame about performance, shame that you'll mess up, whether it's like public speaking or dance lesson or whatever. So similar to how we talked about embarrassment, in this case, it's just a deeper rooted thing.
And I think the root of all of this is self, like not thinking that you're good enough, or that, you just have this inferior like mentality for everything in your life. And so that could even like be in relationships, like, oh, I'm not good enough for this person. So you have this unrequited love, that they'll never pick me. And so that could definitely lead to some shame.
And then also related to exclusion, if you're not included in a group or shunned by a group, like that really messes with your mental, and can cause you to feel shame because like I'm different, or why am I not a part, of community, etc. And I feel like we can see in a lot of like cultural examples of folks who the lone wolf or whatever. And there's other different things too. Maybe you feel shamed if you are. If you're not heterosexual, you might feel shame because, it's like people talking about you don't treat you the same. Maybe if you're like differently able person, like there's so many things. I remember in my kindergarten class, maybe our first grade, like there was these two twins, and I think now maybe it's that they had cerebral palsy or something. And you can just imagine like, maybe even things you can't control, or if you had a stutter or whatever. or if you're the only black person in your class, like you might start to feel ashamed just from seeing like how people treat you differently. And imagine how as a kid or as an adult, like that can affect how you view yourself because everybody else is viewing you a particular way.
Yeah, man, that just made me think about so many kid stories. Kids are, Jesus, a lot. Kids are a lot, honest, but a lot. And that's not to say that shame isn't, like, can't be a good thing. I think that no emotion is bad. We have perceived negative and perceived positive emotions, but no emotion is bad when it's not in excess. So shame can be healthy when it humbles you. We've all been there. Whenever you're allowed to like laugh at yourself, or it can even be a teachable moment. Like, man, I need to do better. Maybe I need to have better boundaries.
Yeah. So kind of what we were saying before, like with societal norms, I think there's some things that are still like maybe wrong or appropriate, but in general, like that's going to kind of be part of the fuel for that. So what would you say are maybe examples of shame or ways that you've dealt with that in your life? You don't have to get super specific, or you can if you want, but like what has been your experience with shame?
Well, now that we've like talked about it more, it made me think about just how my belief that I wasn't enough and how I've struggled with self-worth has like shown up in different places, like not always wanting to be the kid to have the answer, not wanting to always talk in class. And so I feel like in a lot of situations, it kept me from showing up as my full self. Like that's like the first one that I'm really thinking about.
But what is the shame? Like, can you think of like, do you know like what you were ashamed of, or like why did you feel that way?
I think it was like, if we think about, you know, the different like causes or types that we just talked about, it was kind of like exclusion and like humiliation. Like I didn't want to be that person, like to always be the kid to do this and be like labeled as that, or to have that perception. So like
you're saying like you held back from answering stuff.
Yeah,
oh,
exactly.
I thought you were saying you did, and I was like, like,
no, I
you're that little boy in the that little boy in the car. The kids need to free your minds, and everybody was like, damn, you about to get bullied.
So that's like the first kind of thing I was thinking about.
Anything else that you want to talk about?
I mean, we can go back and forth and kind of talk through some of them.
Well, mine's on kind of a main thing that I would say. I would say for me, a lot of shame came from being raised to believe like certain things about how I should act and what's moral and what's not moral. And so as you get older, or for me, as I got older, and then as I'm like exploring my life, and in this case, I would say kind of like it would mostly be like around sex and things like that. And I didn't have sex till I was maybe like 23 or 24, I think 23, which is fine. But then it's like, okay, over time, the experiences that I had, et cetera, it's like I was living a certain way. And yet still, like I knew, like I don't want to say I had to hide those things, but like I wasn't even like, I was blocking myself from like the reality of it. Like if somebody else kind of called me out on something, or like, well, you've been kind of messy over here, or like something, you know, things like that. And it's like, huh? Like, no, I'm not that person. Like, I'm a good person. Or like, I still saw myself through the eyes of like my parents, or like how I was raised. Like I was seeing myself through certain eyes, whereas really like what I was doing wasn't really matching. And so that made it hard for me to even acknowledge that, and not even saying like, oh, acknowledge anything was wrong, but like acknowledge, oh, actually this is me. Not I have this weird like relationship with like, well, what is like, this is a, you know, this isn't bad or whatever, but like I could not, and still cannot, like even like with my parents today, certain things I just don't, like I'm never gonna talk about, they don't ask me about or whatever. And I would feel shame about being my true self. And I don't feel comfortable in certain spaces, like talking about certain things that are true. But not only did I not feel comfortable with that, I didn't feel comfortable having those conversations with myself, or like even acknowledging those things within myself, which that's where the problem was. Until I could own it. I wasn't owning who I really was, because I was just kind of trying to still see myself through a certain way. I don't know how much that like exactly makes sense.
No, it makes sense.
But for me, it was like being disconnected from that really opened my eyes to be like, oh, so how do I actually like step into myself, recognize like who I am, what do I like, what do I do, and be able to live in that reality and be okay with that.
That's a whole word and a whole episode in that point. But something you said like kind of made me think about like how we're shamed for certain things, especially. So I grew up in Oklahoma, if you're new to the Bouch, and Bible Belt. So, you know, and they don't teach sex education and all those things. And I had sex quite a bit earlier than Lexi. I was not in my 20s.
Quite a bit.
Look, but what's interesting is I carried so much shame for so many years. And so in a very different way, but kind of similar in the sense of like, I didn't know who I was because I carried shame for being this person that was out of who I thought I had to be. And it affected my relationships like big. And also myself and my self-worth. Like I thought I was less than because of that, and that I was scarred, like Scarlet Letter type thing. You know what I'm saying? Like I really felt like that for a long time. And I got older and I was like, oh, it's really not that deep. But then I look at how we were talking about how shame can be insidious. I looked at how that caused me to like lower my self-worth in my own eyes because I felt like I didn't live up to this standard. And then I was accepting relationships that didn't treat me, you know, the way, like with respect or with love or with kindness, like in the ways that I feel like I should have been treated. And so it just becomes this big vicious cycle if you don't notice it.
So how would you say, even if it's like looking back at things now, how would you say you could identify like telltale signs of dealing with shame? So like for listeners now, if you're listening to this, like, okay, so do I have shame in my life? Like, what would some of those things maybe look like?
I would say if you find yourself over personalizing negative experiences or things that happen, like events, like, oh man, you know, and this seems to undersimplify, but like, oh, he didn't call me back. Like, it's because I'm whack, or because I'm not that good of a person, or I'm not enough.
You let everything feed the shame.
You let everything feed that negative voice in your head. Man, I didn't get that promotion because I'm not good enough. I didn't do my job well enough. Even though knowing dang well you the first, you know what I'm saying? You are doing all the things. It's like if your thoughts aren't aligning with your actions, like they're below it, or you're trying to validate a negative narrative in a space that doesn't make sense. Like I see that's probably a really good one.
Yeah, I would agree. I think another telltale sign that you're dealing with shame, or like is for me similar to what I was just saying, is if you are like hiding certain things about yourself. Like people have, even recently, people tell me like that I'm not secretive, kind of secretive, but like there's another word I'm thinking of, but like it's like they can tell like they're not getting the full story, and I didn't understand that because I'm like, huh, you are, but then like I said, I wasn't telling myself the full story, or I wasn't accepting it, so like they were getting the best that I could give them. And yet I was hiding things, but I was also hiding them from me. And that's why it never came through. So, you know, hiding things from people. If you do drugs, but then you go around certain people and it's like, you wouldn't say that necessarily. Like that's obvious. That's an obvious shame. Like, oh, I don't want them to know I smoke cigarettes, or that I do whatever. So being different around different people, hiding things, keeping things from people, then that's something that you probably have like a deeper level of actual shame around.
Yeah, that's a big one. Another one I think about is if you're like, when you're scared to advocate for yourself or ask for what you want, you might have shame. For example, like sex. If you can't tell your partner what you want, you might feel shame around the things that you actually like, and that might be worth exploring with a therapist or with somebody else to help you, you know, figure out why you feel like it's not okay to be who you are, to want what you want.
That's a good one. Or you might feel shame around feeling like you're not desirable, and so you always let everybody else like initiate things with you, or tell you things because you don't really see that for yourself. I think another way that we experience shame is in like our behaviors, like in movements, like when you kind of keeping your head down a lot, if you're blushing a lot, like those kind of, I guess I could say obvious. I think that's kind of obvious. But kind of shying away and like, you know, belittling yourself, like trying to make yourself smaller in spaces, can be a signature of feeling shame.
Yeah, body language is a huge one. Noticing what you do when you're around people or in certain things, because sometimes it's like you feel like you're on top of the world and you stand in your power poses, and other times it's you're trying to hide. So pay attention to all of that. Like, it's so interesting how our bodies or how our emotions and our things show up in our bodies. Another one is, and this used to be me and still working on it, but overly worried about like what other people think about you and like their perception. Like, if you're more concerned about somebody else's perception of you than your own, like definitely a space to explore.
Which is also connected to like feeling like a failure, perfectionism. And it's so funny how being a perfectionist really is like the step one of a lot of different things. It really is like a shame, because it's almost like we're ashamed to be humans because we've set or think there's some like standard or whatever we need to be. And because you'll never be perfect, you're literally always feeling shame. Off of if you're a perfectionist. So that's for most people. Like, if you're a perfectionist, you're always feeling shame because you're never good enough. Like, you're literally never good enough. But yeah, there's a lot of different things. Is there anything else that you necessarily want to pull out?
Yeah, underestimating yourself and your abilities. So if you are not taking risks or not stretching yourself or not growing or not putting yourself in spaces where you can grow to get closer to where you want to be or who you want to be or, whatever, like, definitely check your thought patterns and check your feelings on why you're not actually doing that. Because I feel like that's some real deep-rooted shame that can lead us to live smaller lives than what we're capable of.
Mm-hmm. And then the last thing I would say is, if you tend to always be irritable and moody and, just feeling some kind of way, it's like, what is that stemming from? Like, why are you so angry? Why are you so frustrated? And an example of that I can give, like, of somebody else is knowing somebody who, if you know they're going through, this is the guy things. I'm going to straight up say the men. Like, knowing if you're going through something where your money is really funny, there's shame about not feeling like I can't provide, or I can't, like, there's a lot of shame. And a lot of women know, like, a guy who's like down on his money or feeling like that, who has his worth kind of set into some of those things, which I'm not saying is necessarily it should be. But those guys, they get more irritable and they get meaner. And like, that's when things be falling apart. And it's like, as much you might be trying to help them or whatever, it still adds to that, showing them like, oh, I'm not enough. Like, I feel shame that I can't take care of maybe myself or my loved ones.
Mm-hmm. And then I would say last. But on the other side of that coin is if you feel really numb, detached, or disconnected, like, because we all react and respond to things in separate ways. So if you're on either end of the spectrum, like, definitely figure out how you can get back kind of towards the middle.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So basically, it seems like we've said everything. Can be anything negative that you're feeling or going through, could be a signifier of shame. So, like, what's the difference between, like, you just feeling like, oh man, I'm having a bad day or something's happening, and being able to identify that as shame?
Looking for patterns. So looking for something that's consistent. If you're always feeling detached, or if you're always angry, or if you're always shrinking yourself or feeling like you can't express who you are, like, those could be things, but it's like sometimes we all feel each type of way every day, but it's like, if it becomes a pattern like that, then it's time to check it. So I would say consistency would probably be the first thing. What's another one?
And I think too, like, if it keeps you from other people, from communicating, from connecting with people, then that's when you can probably tell it's a little bit deeper than just like a bad day or, just a little off today. And that's a little bit more chronic because it's affecting like your relationships, which is a signifier of like how you're feeling about yourself.
Yeah. I feel like shame actually exists in way more areas of our life than we probably even thought about. Because when we started doing this episode, we were like, I don't know. But then as we researched more, it was like, oh, it actually kind of shows up everywhere. So.
And then I feel like we kind of already talked about some of this, but like things that can bring about feelings of shame, things that can be the cause for that. We've talked about upbringing and maybe growing up feeling like what's right, what's wrong, or seeing like how your parents or guardians acted towards you. Like that tells you about yourself as well.
Yeah, and internalizing trauma or your trauma responses, like feeling shameful for how you survived through trauma, like that could be a shameful thing as well.
We talked about social norms already. I would add things like bullying. So if you've experienced bullying, which I remember I had like one bully. Her name was Annie too. Like this little black girl named Annie. Fuck you, Annie. I remember I had like a ingrown toenail and she like stepped on my foot and I was like, yo. But I don't remember anything else she did. I just remember she had an attitude all the time. But I didn't get like bully, but like being messed with like that. I remember being like sexually harassed type messed with like all through elementary school. Like things that are happening to you from other people are telling you about yourself. And so maybe, of course, I have shame around my body. I didn't even wear, now I'm connecting that. Like I wouldn't have called it shame, but like I would not wear shorts. I didn't feel comfortable wearing shorts. I didn't feel comfortable wearing bikinis. And we've talked about this story where like I didn't feel perhaps comfortable doing certain things, or I didn't want to be seen. That's where that came from, because I kept getting messed with. And so I would get shame around being seen. So yes, I'm going to try to like shrink myself or blend in or whatever it is. And then as you get older, still maybe feeling in some ways like a shame around being touched or doing certain things or whatever might be stemming from that. There's super traumatic things that are in the same boats, or like where maybe somebody's uncle touched them inappropriately or something happened, right? Like when those things happen, you can feel a lot of shame because like, why did this happen to me? Or like, oh my gosh, like this must be because I'm something. And then we go so long and man, I even tell anybody about it. Like I've never told anybody, not anybody. I never talked to my parents about that when I was a kid while it was happening. So like a lot of times too, it's like we think it's because of us, or like, oh, this never happens or whatever. And you might not tell anybody. And so that's a big signifier of it being a shame as well. But those are the types of things that like can be the seed for it.
And I think all of those are so important. And I think important to think about as roots and looking at how they kind of manifest in our life. I think another signifier to kind of watch for is if you have shame around like speaking up for yourself, or you feel really uncomfortable with setting boundaries with people. It's like sometimes you can have shame on the opposite end where it might not serve you. Like I think that a lot of those behaviors we did served us and helped us survive through things. But whenever we get older and are growing through that and releasing trauma and elevating, our mindsets and stuff, like sometimes we have shame around not being who we thought we were, and know that like that's another area to kind of watch for shame to come up.
Say that last part again. We have shame
around letting go of who we used to be and growing into a new person. So if it was like, man, I used to be the cool girl and never say anything in relationships, when stuff would bother me, it's like, no, now I'm the person who actually speaks up for myself, and I don't have to feel shame around that.
Yeah, that makes sense too. And then so there are other ways to identify, like maybe even for your own, like if this is a behavior from shame or other people, and there's 4 different like behavior responses to shame that I was reading about. The first one is a hot response. So if you've ever been like kind of talking to somebody and it seems like they're getting way more angry than like what's warranted. They might be deflecting the attention to you, or you da da da, or like it's making it weird. Sometimes you talk to people and it's like, what? How do we get here? But maybe you either touch a nerve, maybe they do feel some type of shame around something, get defensive, etc. So for a lot of people, like when you might get angry, and that really might be signifying dealing with shame.
Yeah. Another one, I think that's probably really common. I think another common one is concealing, or like to conceal it. So it's a coping mechanism. Like you shut down, you try to make yourself small or withdraw. Like I think those are those are very easy for me to see in my life, at least.
And then avoidance, which I probably super have too, is like when you just shut down, when you're maybe crying or apologizing, doing things to avoid conflict. So that was a big issue for me in dealing with like the same issue. Is like if somebody was kind of judging me or saying something about me, I'm like, like I'm trying to avoid conflict, so I'm not saying certain things. I'm not being forthright. I'm hiding things because like I don't want to start something, but really I'm also like not growing or not being myself and all those things too. So avoiding everything is a way that some people deal with it.
And then the last like typical behavior is to repair. So like soothing yourself, apologizing, but also like making justifications for things. So if you forgot someone's birthday or like your anniversary with your partner, and then you start telling yourself, well, I did have a busy week and they had to work tonight anyways, and it's really not that big of a deal. And you start trying to self-soothe by like justifying your way out of it.
Yeah. And so even in having this conversation today or in this episode, right, with shame, we came to it and we were like, okay, we're in a place in our lives now where we actually can kind of identify like, oh, that might be shame, or, you know, this is where that came from or whatever. So we really thought it was important just to even like focus on identifying that or think about that, right? Like my hope from this episode is that it sparks you to think about like, oh, do I have shame in my life? Like, or where am I experiencing shame, or what is something that I can take a microscope to and like really pay more attention to see like, where did that come from? Like, what does that mean? What am I saying about myself, or what's the disconnect? Because for me, like it truly is a like a groundbreaking thing to be able to all of a sudden just understand and connect the dot. Like, oh, like this is it doesn't connect because like I'm not connected on that, or like I'm like trying to act like that something didn't exist or whatever, right? With my own like personal experience. So just to connect those dots can make a huge difference in how you move forward, how you maybe own yourself, own who you are, own your experiences, own how you grew up, etc. And so that's really like the main thing that I would say we wanted you to get out of this episode.
Yeah, because if you don't address the shame in your life where you have it, I think it's harder for you to live like the depth and breadth and the width like of who you are as a person, and also how you show up in life, because could be holding yourself back without even noticing it just because you're so used to it.
Yeah, so when we were like, okay, so like how do you deal with it, like what's next? And it's like, oh, it's the same steps as we always talking about: identifying it, paying attention to it, looking at it, like identifying those slow small steps, etc., right? The self-love, changing your self-talk, mindset, yada, 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 right? And yet, like I just said, so I really need to stop repeating myself, is that, oh, but none of that matters if we're not even identifying that we have it. Like I said, I would have never been like, yeah, I have a lot of shame. Like, no, I don't have shame about anything. But to realize it, that's the key.
So start there. Hit us at Carlie's Couch. Let us know what you thought of the episode. If you have any other thoughts or questions about shame, or anything that really stood out, like how, you know, where you might have identified it in your life, at Carlie's Couch on every social media platform, at Lextopia, at @CCFierce/Carlie Carpio.
And this week's question of the week, to Carlie first. Do you believe in extraterrestrials and aliens? First of all, why are you doing that dance right now? But all right.
Because I'm like, ooh. I don't not believe in them. I don't think that there's like little green people out there, how we've been fed on all the social media, but I do believe that there are other things. It's an entire freaking like Milky Way of things. So of course there are other things that live out there. What about you?
I agree. And I think it's interesting too. I like when I do see media or like entertainment that puts them in a different perspective, because I think it's always so funny how like, why would we assume aliens like smell and see and like, you know, have to have eyes, like even if it's whether it's 2 eyes or 100 eyes, it's like, no, literally like this wood table could be like alive somewhere else, but like to us it's just, you know, what it is. But I for sure think that there is life in other places, and what that looks like, who knows? But I like the end of Men in Black. I thought that was so fire at the end when they were like playing marbles, and then it like kept zooming out and out and out into like, oh, like really the Earth is like within this tiny little thing in this marble that these other aliens are playing, and they're in another whatever. So yeah, it's definitely, I don't think it's beyond us. I think they exist, like how they exist and all that, I don't know. But yeah, please come get me.
Nah, they were like, the Earth is ghetto. Absolutely.
Please come get me if you're listening to the podcast.
Save us.
Right. They like, nah, we gonna cruise past this one. And should.
All right, y'all. Have a good week. Hit us at Carlie's Couch. Let us know what you thought.
Bye.